Chapter 1. An Unexpected Journey. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole, filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. It had a perfectly round door like a porthole, painted green, with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. The door opened to a tube-shaped hall like a tunnel, a very comfortable tunnel without smoke, with paneled walls and floors tiled and carpeted, provided with polished chairs and lots of pegs for hats and coats. The hobbit was fond of visitors. The tunnel wound on, going fairly but not quite straight into the side of the hill. The hill, as all the people for miles around called it, and many little round doors opened out of it, first on one side and then another. Not going upstairs for a hobbit, bedrooms, bathrooms, cellars, pantries, lots of these. Wardrobes, he had whole rooms devoted to clothes. Kitchens, dining rooms, all were on the same floor, and indeed on the same passage. The best rooms were on the left-hand side, going in, for these were the only ones to have windows. Deep set round windows looking over his gardens, and meadows beyond, sloping down to his river. The hobbit was a very well-to-do hobbit, and his name was Baggins. The Bagginses had lived in the neighborhood of the hill for time out of mind. The people considered them very respectable, not only because most of them were rich, but also because they had never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. You could tell what a Baggins would say or any question without the bother of asking him. This is the story of how a Baggins had an adventure. He found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected. He may have lost the neighbors' respect, but he gained. Well, you will see whether he gained anything in the end. The mother of our particular hobbit. What is a hobbit? I suppose hobbits need some description nowadays, since they have become rare and shy of the big people, as they call us. They are, or we were, a little people, about half our height and smaller than the bearded dwarves. Hobbits have no beards. There is little to no magic about them, except the ordinary everyday sort which helps them to disappear quietly and quickly, where large stupid folk like you and me come blundering along, making noise like elephants, which they can hear a mile off. They are inclined to be fat in the stomach. They dress in bright colors, chiefly green and yellow, wear no shoes because their feet grow naturally leathery soles, and thick warm brown hair like the stuff on our heads, which is curly. They have long clever brown fingers, good-natured faces, and laughs, deep fruity laughs, especially after dinner, which they have twice a day when they can get it. Now you know enough to go on. As I was saying, the mother of this hobbit, of Bilbo Baggins, that is, was the famous Belladonna Took, one of the three remarkable sisters of the old Took, head of the hobbits who lived across the water, the small river that ran at the foot of the hill. It was often said in the other families that long ago one of the Took ancestors must have taken a fairy wife. That, of course, absurd, but certainly there was still something not entirely hobbit-like about them. And once in a while, members of the Took clan would go and have adventures. They discreetly disappeared, and the family hushed it up. But the fact remained that the Tooks were not as respectable as the Bagginses, though they were undoubtedly richer. Now, not that Belladonna Took ever had an adventure after she became Mrs. Bungo Baggins. Bungo was Bilbo's father, built the most luxurious hobbit hole for her, and partly with her money, that was ever found either under the hill or over the hill or across the water, and there they remained to the end of their days. Still, it was probable that Bilbo, her only son, although he looked and behaved exactly like a second edition of his solid and comfortable father, got something a bit queer in his make-up from the Took side, something that only waited for a chance to come out. The chance never arrived until Bilbo Baggins had grown up, being about 50 years old or so, and living in a beautiful hobbit hole built by his father, which I have just described for you, until he had in fact apparently settled down immovably. By some curious chance, one morning long ago in the quiet of the world, There was less noise and more green, and the hobbits were still numerous and prosperous. Bilbo Baggins was standing at his door after breakfast, smoking an enormous long wooden pipe that reached nearly down to his woolly toes, neatly brushed. Gandalf came by. Gandalf, if you have heard only a quarter of what I have heard about him, I have only heard a very little of all that is to hear. You would be prepared for any sort of remarkable tale. Tales and adventures sprouted up all over the place wherever he went, in the most extraordinary fashion. He had not been down the way under the hill for ages and ages, not since his friends the old Took died. In fact, the hobbits had almost forgotten what he looked like. He had been away over the hill and across the water on business of his own since they were all small hobbit boys and hobbit girls. All that the unsuspecting Bilbo saw that morning was an old man with a staff. He had a tall pointed blue hat, a long grey cloak, a silver scarf over which he had a long white beard hung down below his waist, and immense black boots. "Good morning," Bilbo said, and he meant it. The sun was shining, and the grass was very green. But Gandalf looked at him from under long bushy eyebrows that stuck out farther than the brim of his shady hat. "What do you mean?" he said. "Do you wish me a good morning, or mean that it is a good morning whether I want it or not? Or that you feel good this morning, or that it has been a good morning to be on?" All of them at once," said Bilbo, "and a very fine morning for a pipe of tobacco out of doors, and into the bargain. If you have a pipe about you, sit down and have a fill of mine. There's no hurry, we have all day before us." Then Bilbo sat down on a seat by his door, crossed his legs, and blew out a beautiful grey ring of smoke that sailed up into the air without breaking and floating away over the hill. "Very pretty," said Gandalf, "but I have no time to blow smoke rings this morning. I am looking for someone to share an adventure that I am arranging. It's very difficult to find anyone." "I should think so, in these parts. We are plain quiet folk, and have no use for adventures. Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things. Make you late for dinner. I can't think what anybody sees in them," said our Mr. Baggins, and stuck one thumb behind his braces, and blew out another even bigger smoke ring. Then he took one of his morning letters, and began to read, pretending that there was no more notice of the old man. He had decided he was not quite for his sort, wanted to have him go away. But the old man did not move. He stood leaning on his stick, and gazing at the hobbit without saying anything, till Bilbo got quite uncomfortable and even a little cross. "Good morning," he said at last. "We don't want any adventures here, thank you. You might try over the hill or across the water." By this he meant that the conversation was at an end. "What a lot of things you used to say good morning for," said Gandalf. "Now you mean that you want to get rid of me, and it won't be good till I move off." Not at all, dear sir. Let me see, I don't think I know your name." Yes, my dear sir, and I do know your name, Mr. Bilbo Baggins, and you know my name, though you don't remember that I belong to it. I am Gandalf, and Gandalf means me. To think that I should have lived to a good morning by Belladonna Took's son, and if I was selling buttons at the door. Gandalf, good gracious me. Not the wandering wizard that gave old Took a pair of magic diamond studs that fastened themselves and never came undone till ordered. Not the fellow who used to tell such wonderful stories at parties, about dragons and goblins and giants, and the rescue of princesses, and the unexpected luck of widowed sons. Not the man who used to have made particularly excellent fireworks. I remember those. Old Took used to have them at Midsummer's Eve. Splendid. They used to go up like great lilies and snapdragons and laburnums of fire, and hang in the twilight all evening. You will notice already that Mr. Baggins is not quite so posy as he would like to believe, although he was very fond of flowers. Dear me, he went on, not the Gandalf who was responsible for so many quiet lads and lasses going off into the blue for some mad adventures. Anything from climbing trees to visiting elves, or sailing in ships, sailing to other shores. Bless me, life used to be quite you used to upset a little badly in the parts once upon a time. I beg your pardon, but I have no idea you were still in business. Where else would I be, said the wizard. All the same, I am pleased to find you remembering something about me. You seem to remember my fireworks kindly. At any rate, and thanks, that is not without hope. Indeed, for your old grandfather Took's sake, and for the sake of poor Belladonna, I will give you what you asked. I beg your pardon? I haven't asked for anything. Yes, you have, twice now. My pardon. I give it to you. In fact, I will go so far as send you on this adventure. Very amusing for me, very good for you, and profitable too. Very likely if you ever got over it. Sorry, I don't want any adventures, thank you. Not today. Good morning. Please come to tea any time you like. Why not tomorrow? Come tomorrow. Goodbye. With that, the hobbit turned and scuttled into his round green door and shut it quickly as he dared, not to seem rude. Wizards, after all, are wizards. What on earth did I ask him to tea for? He said to himself, as he went to the pantry. He had only just had breakfast, but he thought of a cake or two and a drink of something would do him good after his fright. Gandalf, in the meantime, was still standing outside the door, and he laughed long but quietly. After a while he stepped up, and with a spike on his staff scratched a queer sign on the hobbit's beautiful green front door. Then he strode away just about the time when Bilbo was finishing his second cake, and beginning to think that he had escaped the adventures very well. The next day he almost forgotten about Gandalf. He did not remember things very well, unless he put down on his engagement tablet, like this, Gandalf, tea, Wednesday. Yesterday he had been too flustered to do anything of the kind. Just before tea time there came a tremendous ring on the front doorbell, and then he remembered. He rushed and put on the kettle, and put out another cup and saucer, and an extra cake or two, and ran to the door. "I'm so sorry to keep you waiting," he was going to say, but then he saw it was not Gandalf at all. It was a dwarf with a blue beard tucked into his golden belt, very bright eyes under his dark green hood. As soon as the door was opened, he pushed inside just as if he'd been expected. He hung his hood on the nearest peg, and "Dwarven, at your service," he said in a low bow. "Bilbo, at yours," said the hobbit, too surprised to ask any questions for the moment. When the silence that followed had become uncomfortable, he added, "I am just about to take tea. Pray come and have some with me." A little stiff, perhaps, but he meant it kindly. And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came and hung his things up in your hall without a word of explanation? They had not been at the table for long. In fact, they had hardly reached the third cake, when there came another even louder ring at the bell. "Excuse me," said the hobbit, and he went off to the door. "So you have got here at last." That was what he was going to say to Gandalf this time, but it was not Gandalf. Instead, there was a very old-looking dwarf at the step with a white beard and a scarlet hood. He too hopped inside as soon as the door was opened, just as if he had been invited. "I see that they have begun to arrive already," he said, when he caught sight of Dwarlin's green hood hanging up. He hung his red one next to it, and "Barlin, at your service," he said with his hand at his breast. "Thank you," said Bilbo with a gasp. It had not been the correct thing to say, but they have begun to arrive had flustered him badly. He liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they arrived, and he preferred to ask them himself. He had a horrible thought about the cakes might run short, and then he, as the host, knew his duty and stuck to it however painful. He might have to go without. "Come along in, and have some tea." He managed to say something after taking a deep breath. "A little beer would suit me better. And if it is all the same to you, my good sir," said Barlin with the white beard. "But I don't mind some cake. Seed cake, if you have any." "Lots." Bilbo found himself answering, to his own surprise, and he found himself scuttling off to the cellars to fill a pint beer mug, and then to the pantry to fetch 2 beautiful round seed cakes, which he had baked that afternoon for his after-supper morsel. When he got back to Darlin and Dwarlin were talking at the table, like old friends. As a matter of fact, they were brothers. Bilbo plumbed down the beer and the cake in front of them. Then came a loud ring at the bell again, and then another ring. Gandalf for certain this time, he thought as he puffed along the passage. But it was not. It was 2 more dwarfs, both with blue hoods, silver belts, and yellow beards. And each of them carried a bag of tools and a spade, and they hopped as soon as the door began to open. Bilbo was hardly surprised at all. "What can I do for you, my dwarves?" he said. "Killy at your service," said one, and "Filly," added the other. They both swept off their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and yours family," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. "Dwarlen and Barlen here already, I see," said Killy. "Let us join them." "Throng," said Mr. Baggins. "I don't like the sound of that. I really must sit down for a minute and collect my wits, and have a drink." He had only just had a sip in the corner, while the four dwarfs sat around the table and talked about mines and golds and troubles with the goblins, and the depredations of the dragon, and lots of other things which he did not understand, and he did not want to, for they sounded much too adventurous, when ding-dong-along-dong, his bell rang again, as if some naughty little Dobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off. "Somebody at the door," he said, blinking. "Some four, I should say by the sound of it. Besides, we saw them coming along behind us in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head in his hands, and wondered what had happened, what was going to happen, and whether they were to stay till supper. Then the bell rang again, even louder than ever, and he ran to the door. It was not only four, after all, it was five. Another dwarf had come along while he was wandering in the hall. He had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, "At your service," one after another. Dory, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin were their names. And very soon 2 purple hoods, a grey hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were hanging on the pegs, as they marched with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already it had almost become a throng. Some called for ale, and others for porter, and one for coffee, and all of them for cakes. So the hobbit kept very, very busy for a while. A big jug of coffee had just been set in the hearth, and seed cakes were gone, and the dwarfs were starting on a round of buttered scones, when they came, a loud knock. Not a ring, but a hearty rat-tat-tat on the hobbit's beautiful green door. Somebody was banging with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage, very angry and altogether bewildered and bewildered. This is the most awkward ones he had ever remembered. He pulled open the door with a jerk, then they all fell in, one on top of another. More dwarfs, 4 more, and there was Gandalf behind, leaning on his staff and laughing. He had made quite a dent on the beautiful door. He had also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark that he had put there the morning before. Carefully, he said. "It's not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting at the mat, and then open the door like a pop gun. Let me introduce Bifur, Bofur, Bombur, and especially Thorin." "At your service," said Bifur, Bofur, Bombur, standing in a row. Then they hung up 2 yellow hoods and a pale green one, and also a sky blue one with a long silver tassel. This belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf, in fact no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, who had not all but pleased at falling flat in Bombur's mat with Bifur, Bofur, Bombur on top of him. For one thing, Bombur was immensely fat and heavy. Thorin indeed was very haughty and said nothing about service, but poor Mr. Baggins said he was sorry so many times, and the last he grunted, "Pray, don't mention it," and stopped frowning. "Now we are all here," said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, and the best detachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs. "Quite a merry gathering, I hope. There is something left for the late corners to eat and drink." "What's that, tea?" "No, thank you. I like a little red wine, I thank you." "And for me," said Thorin. "A raspberry jam and apple tart," said Bifur. "A nice mince pie and cheese," said Bofur. "A pork pie and salad," said Bombur. "And more cakes and ale and coffee, if you don't mind," called the other dwarfs through the door. "But a few eggs, there's a good fellow," Gandalf called after him. The hobbit stumped off to the pantries, and just bring out some cold chicken and pickles. "Sometimes I know as much about the insides of my larders as I do myself." Though Mr. Baggins, who was feeling positively flummoxed, was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he got all his bottles and dishes and knives and forks and glasses and plates and spoons and things piled up on big trays, he was getting very hot and red in the face, and annoyed. "Confuscate and be bothered by dwarves," he said aloud. "Why don't they come and lend a hand?" Lo and behold, there stood Barlen and Dwarlen at the door of the kitchen, and Filly and Killy behind them, and before he could say knife, they had whisked the trays and a couple of small tables into the Powler and set everything out afresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party with 13 dwarves around him, and Bilbo sat on the stool at the fireside, nibbling at a biscuit. His appetite was quite taken away, and trying to look as if this was all perfectly ordinary and not at least an adventure. The dwarves ate and talked, and time got on. At last they pushed into their chairs and back, and Bilbo made a move to collect the plates and glasses. "I suppose you will all stay till supper," he said in a politest of pressing tones. "Of course," said Thorin. "After all, we shan't get through the business till late, and we must have some music first. Now clear up." Thereupon the 12 dwarves, not Thorin, he was too important, and stayed talking to Gandalf, jumped to their feet and made tall piles of all things. Off they went, not waiting for trays balanced in columns of plates, each with a bottle on top, with one hand, while the hobbit ran after them, almost squeaking with fright. "Please be careful, and please don't trouble. I can manage." But the dwarves only started singing. "Chip the glasses and crack the plates, blunt the knives and bend the forks. That's the way Bilbo Baggins hates. Smash the bottles and burn the corks. Cut the cloth and tread on the fat. Pour the milk on the pantry floor. Leave the bones in the bedroom mat. Splash the wine on every door. Dump the crocks in a boiling bowl. Pour them up with thumping pull, and then you finished if any are whole. Stand them down on the hall to roll. That's the way Bilbo Baggins hates. So carefully with the plates." And of course, there were none of these dreadful things, and everything was clean and put away safe as quick as lightning, while the hobbit was turning around and around in the middle of the kitchen, trying to see what they were doing. Then they went back and found Thorin with his feet and Fender smoking in a pipe. He was blowing the most enormous smoke rings, and wherever he told one to go, it went, up the chimney or behind the clock on the mantelpiece, or under the table, or around and round the ceiling. Wherever it went, it was not quick enough to escape Gandalf. Pop! He sent a smaller smoke ring from his short clay pipe straight through each one of Thorin's, and then Gandalf's smoke ring would go green and come back to hover over the wizard's head. He had a cloud of them about him already, and in the dim light he made them look strange and sorcerous. Bilbo stood still and watched his loved smoke rings, and then he blushed to think how proud he had been yesterday morning of his smoke rings he sent up the wind over the hill. "Now for some music," said Thorin. "Bring out the instruments." Killy and Felly rushed for their bags and brought back little fiddles. Dori, Nori, Nori brought out flutes from somewhere inside their coats. Bumber produced a drum from the hall. Bifer and Bofer went out too and came back with clarinets they had brought along with walking sticks. Dwarlin and Barlin said, "Excuse me, I left mine on the porch." "Just bring mine in with yours," said Thorin. They came back with viols as big as themselves, and with Thorin's harp wrapped in green cloth. It was a beautiful golden harp, and when Thorin struck it, a music began all at once, so sudden and sweet that Bilbo forgot everything else, and was swept away in the dark land under strange moons, far under the water and very far from his hobbit hole under the hill. The dark came in the room from little windows that opened in the side of the hill. The firelight flickered. It was April, and they played on, while the shadows of Gandalf's beard wagged against the wall. The dark filled out all the room, and the fire died down, and the shadows were lost, and still they played on. Then suddenly first and then another began to sing as they played, deep-throated singing of dwarves, and the deep places of their ancient homes. And this is like a fragrance of their song. It came like their song without their music. Far over the misty mountain cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must always ere break the day, to seek the pale enchanted gold. The dwarves of yore made mighty spells, while hammers fell like ringing bells, in places deep where dark things slept, and hollow halls beneath the fells. For ancient king and elvish lord, they many a gleam and golden hoard, they shaped and wrought for light they caught, to hide in gems and hilt of sword. On silver necklace they strung, the flower stars or on crowns they hung. The dragon fire and twisted wire, they meshed the light of moon and sun. Far over the misty mountain cold, their dungeons deep and cavernous old, we must away ere break of day, to claim our long-forgotten gold. Goblets they carved there for themselves, and harp of gold. Where no man devils they laid there long, and many a song was sung unheard of by men and elves. The pines were roaring on the height, the wind was moaning in the night, the fire was red as flaming spread, the trees like torches blazed with light. The bells were ringing in the dale, and the men looked up with faces pale. Then dragons' ire more fierce than fire laid low their challers in the houses frail. The mountains smoked beneath the moon. The dwarves, they heard the tramp was of doom. They fled their hall to die and fall beneath his feet, beneath the moon. Far of the misty mountain grim, to dungeons deep and caverns dim, we must away ere break of day, to win our harps and gold from him. As they sang, the hobbits fell in love of beautiful things made by their hands and by cunning and magic moving through him. A fierce and jealous love, the desire of the hearts of dwarves. Then something tookish woke up inside him, and he wished to go and see the great mountains. He heard the pine trees and the waterfalls and explore the caves, and wear a sword instead of a walking stick. He looked up out of the window. The stars were out in the dark sky above the trees. He thought of the jewel of the dwarves shining in the dark caverns. Suddenly in the wood beyond the water a flame leapt up, probably somebody lighting a wood fire. He thought of the plundering dragon settling on his quiet hill, kindling it to flames. He shuddered, and very quickly he was playing Mr. Baggins of Bag End, Underhill again. He got up trembling. He was left in half a mind to fetch the lamp, and more than half a mind to pretend to, and go to hide behind the beer barrels in the cellar, not come out until the dwarves had gone away. Suddenly he found that the music, the singing had stopped, and they were all looking at him with eyes shining in the dark. "Where are you going?" said Thorin, in a tone that seemed to show he guessed both halves of the hobbit's mind. What about a little light?" said Bilbo apologetically. "We like the dark," said the dwarves. "Dark for dark business. Here are many hours before dawn." "Of course," said Bilbo. They sat down in a hurry. He missed and stood and sat in the fetter, knocking over the pokers and shovel with a crash. "Hush," said Gandalf. "Let Thorin speak." And then with the bow, Thorin began. "Gandalf, dwarves, and Mr. Baggins, we are met together in the house of our friend and fellow conspirator. There's most excellent and audacious hobbits. Men, may the hair on their toes never fall out, and praise his wine and ale." He paused for breath and for a polite remark from the hobbit, but compliments were quite lost upon poor Bilbo Baggins, who was wagging his mouth in protest at being called audacious and, worst of all, fellow conspirator. Then no noise came out. He was so flummoxed, so Thorin went on. "We are met in discussion our plans, our ways, means, policy, and devices. We shall soon before the break of day start on our long journey, a journey from which some of us, or perhaps all of us, except our friend and fellow counselor, the ingenious wizard Gandalf, may never return. It is a seldom moment. Our object is, I take it, well known to all of us. To the estimable Mr. Baggins, or perhaps to one of the younger dwarves, I think I should be right in naming Killian Felly, for instance. The exact situation at the moment may require a little brief explanation." This was Thorin's style. He was an important dwarf. If he had been allowed, he would probably have gone on like this until he was out of breath, without telling any one of them anything that they had not known already. But he was rudely interrupted. Poor Bilbo couldn't bear it any longer, and may never return. He began to feel a shriek come up inside. It very seemed to burst out like a whistle of an engine coming out of a tunnel. All the dwarfs sprang up, knocking over the table. Gandalf struck a blue light at the end of his magic staff. In its firework gale, the poor little hobbit could be seen kneeling on a hearth rug, shaking like jelly that was melting. Then he was flat on the floor and kept on calling out, struck by lightning, over and over again. And that was all he could get out of him, for a long time. Soon they took him and laid him out of the way, on the drawing-room sofa, with a drink at his elbow, and they went back to talking their dark business. "Excitable little fellow," said Gandalf, as he sat down again. "Gets funny queer fits, but he is one of the best. As fierce as a dragon in a pinch. If you have ever seen a dragon in a pinch, you will realize that is only a potential exaggeration applied to any hobbit. Even Two Old Took's great-great-uncle Bulroar, who was so huge for a hobbit he could ride a horse. He charged the ranks of goblins at Mount Graham in the Battle of the Green Fields, and knocked their king, Gulfimbruller's head clean off with a wooden club. It sailed 100 yards through the air and went down a rabbit hole. And in this way the battle was won, and the game of golf invented at the same moment. In the meanwhile, however, Bullroller's gentler descendant was reviving in the drawing room. After a while and drink, he crept nervously to the door of the parlor. This is what he heard, Gloin speaking. Or something snortless like that. Well, do you think? It is very well for Gandalf to talk about the Hobbit being fierce, but one streak like that, in a moment of excitement, would be enough to wake the dragon and all his relatives, and kill the lot of us. I think it sounded more like fright than excitement. In fact, it has not been for the sign on the door, I should have never been sure we were coming to the wrong house. As soon as I clapped eyes on the little fellow, bobbing and puffing at the mat, I had my doubts. He looks like a grocer, more like a grocer than a burglar. Then Mr. Baggins turned the handle and went in. The Took's side had won. He suddenly felt he would go without bed and breakfast to be thought fierce. As for little fellow bobbing on the mat, it almost made him really fierce. Many a time after the Baggins part regretted did now, and he said to himself, Bilbo, you are a fool. You walked right in and put your foot in. Pardon me, he said, if I have overheard the words that you are saying. I don't pretend to understand what you are talking about, or the reference to burglars. But I think I am right in believing, this is what he called being on his dignity, that you think I am no good. I will show you. I have no sign on my door. It was painted a week ago, and I am quite sure that ye have come to the wrong house. As soon as I saw your funny faces at the doorstep, I had my doubts, but treat it as the right one. Tell me what you want done, and I will try, as if have to walk here from east to east and fight the wild worms in the last desert. I had a great-great-uncle once, Bulroar Took, and yes, but that was long ago, said Gloin. I was talking about you. I assumed that there was a mark on this door, the usual one in the trade, except used to be. Burglar wants a good job, plenty of excitement, and a reasonable reward. That's how it is usually written. I can say expert treasure hunter instead of burglar if you like. Some of them do. It's all the same to us. Gandalf told us that there was a man of the swords in the park looking for a job at once, and that he had arranged for a meeting here this Wednesday, tea time. Of course, there is a mark, said Gandalf. I put it there myself, for very good reasons. You may ask me that the 14th man of your expedition. I choose Mr. Baggins. Just let anyone say I was wrong to choose, or the wrong house, and he can stop at 13 and have all your bad luck you like. So go back to digging coal. He scowled so angrily at Gloin that the dwarf huddled back in his chair, and when Bilbo tried to open his mouth to ask a question, he turned and frowned at him and stuck out his bushy eyebrows, till Bilbo shut his mouth tight with a snap. That's right, said Gandalf, there is no more argument. I have chosen Mr. Baggins, and that ought to be enough for all you. I say he is a burglar he is, or will there be time comes. There is a lot more in him than you'd guess, and a deal more than he has any idea of himself. So you may, possibly, all live to thank me yet. Now, Bilbo, my boy, fetch the lamp and let's have a little light on this. On the table, on the light, was a big lamp with a red shade. He spread a piece of parchment rather like a map. This was made by Thorir, your great-grandfather Thorin, he said, in answer to the dwarf's excited questions. It is a plan of the mountains. I don't see that this will help us much, said Thorin disappointedly after a glance. I remember the mountain well enough, and the lands about it. I know where Mirkwood is, and the weathered heath, where the great dragons bred. There is a dragon mark at the red on the mountain, said Barlin. It would be easy enough to find him without that, if we ever arrive there. There is one point that you haven't noticed, said the wizard. There is a secret entrance. You see the rune on the west side, the hand pointing to it from the other runes? The marks are hidden passage to the lower halls. Look at the map at the beginning of this book, and you will see the runes in red. It may have been a secret once, said Thorin, but how do you know that it is a secret longer? Old Smog has lived there long enough to now to find out there is no about this caves. He may, but he hasn't used it for years and years. Why? Because it is too small. 5 feet high and the door 3 wide, may walk abreast, says the runes. But Smog could not creep into a hole that size. Not even when he was a young dragon. Certainly not after devouring so many dwarves and men of Dale. It seems a great big hole to me, squeaked Bilbo, who had no experience of dragons and only of hobbit holes. He was getting excited and interested again, so he forgot to keep his mouth shut. He loved maps, and his hall had a large one of the country round, with all his favorite walks marked in red ink. How should a large door be kept secret from anybody outside apart from the dragon? He asked. He was only a little hobbit, you must remember. In lots of ways. But in what way this one has been hidden, we don't know without going to see. From what is said on the map, I should guess that there is a closed door which has been made to look exactly like the side of the mountain. That is the usual dwarf method. I think that is right, isn't it? Quite right, said Thorin. Also, went on Gandalf, I forgot to mention that the map with a key, a small and curious key. Here it is, he said, and handed to Thorin a key with a long barrel and an intricate wards made of silver. Keep it safe. Indeed I will, said Thorin. He fastened it upon a fine chain and hung around his neck and under his jacket. Now things began to look more hopeful. This news alters them for much better. So far we have had no clear idea on what to do. We thought of going east, as quiet and careful as we could, as far as the Long Lake. After the trouble we would begin. A long time before that, if I know anything about the roads east, interrupted Gandalf. We might go from there up along the river running, went Thorin without taking no notice, and so the ruins of Dale, the old town in the valley there under the shadow of the mountain. But we none of this like the idea of the front gate. The river running right out of it to the great cliff at the south of the mountain, and out it comes the dragon too. Far too often, unless he changes his habits. There would be no good, said the wizard. Not without a mighty warrior, even a hero. I have tried to find one, but warriors are busy fighting one another in distant lands, and in this neighborhood heroes are scarce, or simply not to be found. Swords in the parts are mostly blunt, and axes are used for trees, and shields are cradles or dish covers, and dragons are comfortably far off, and therefore legendary. And this is why I settled on burglary, especially when I remembered that the existence of the side door. And here's our little Bilbo Baggins, the burglar, the chosen and selected burglar. Now let's get on and make some plans. Very well then, said Thorin, supposing that the burglar expert gives us some ideas and suggestions. He turned with mock politeness to Bilbo. First, I should like to know a bit about things, he said, feeling all confused and a bit shaky inside, but so far still tookishly determined to go on with things. I mean about the gold, the dragon, and all that, and how it got here, and who it belongs to, and so on and so further. Bless me, said Thorin, haven't you got a map? And don't you hear our song? Haven't we been talking about this for hours? All the same, I should like it all plain and clear, he said obstinately, putting on his business manner, usually reserved for people who tried to borrow money off him, and doing his best to appear wise and prudent and professional, and live up to Gandalf's recommendations. Also, I should like to know about risks, out-of-pocket expenses, and time required, and remuneration, and so forth. By that he meant, what am I going to get out of it, and am I going to come back alive? Oh, very well, said Thorin. Long ago, in my grandfather Thor's time, our family was driven out of the far north, and came back with all their wealth and their tools to this mountain on the map. It had been discovered by my far ancestor, Thrain the Old. But now they mined and they tunneled, and they had made auger halls and greater workshops. And in addition, I believe they found a good deal of gold and a great many jewels too. Anyway, they grew immensely rich and famous. My grandfather was king under the mountain again, and treated with great reverence by mortal men who lived in the south, and were gradually spreading up the running river as far as the valley overshadowed by the mountains. They built a merry town of Dale there in those days. King used to send for our smith, and rewarded ever with even the least skilled most richly. Father would beg us to take their sons as apprentices, and pay us handsomely, especially in food supplies, which we never bothered to grow or find ourselves. Altogether, those were good days for us, and the poorest of us had money to spend and to lend, and leisure to make beautiful things just for the fun of it, not to speak for the most marvelous and magical toys, the like of which has not been found in the world nowadays. So my grandfather's halls became full of armor and jewels and carvings and cups, and the toy market of Dale was the wonder of the north. Undoubtedly, that's what brought the dragon. Dragons steal gold and jewels, for men and elves and dwarves, wherever they can find it, and they guard their plunder as long as they live, which is practically forever unless they are killed, and never enjoy a brass ring of it. Indeed, they hardly know a good bit of work from bad, though they usually have a good notion of the current market value, and they can't make a thing for themselves, not even mend a little loose scale of their armor. There are lots of dragons in the north in those days, and gold is probably getting scarce up there, with the dwarves flying south or getting killed, and all the general waste and destruction the dragons make going from bad to worse. There was a most specially greedy, strong, and wicked worm called Smog. One day he flew up into the air and came south. The first we heard, it was a noise like a hurricane coming from the north. The pine trees in the mountain creaked and cracked in the wind. Some of the dwarves who had happened to be outside, I was one lucky and a fine adventurous lad in those days, always wandering about, and saved my life that. Well, for the good way off, we saw the dragon settle on a mountain and spout a flame. Then he came down the slopes, and when he reached the wood, they all went up in fire. By the time that all the bells were ringing in Dale and warriors were arming, the dwarfs rushed out their great gate, but there was a dragon waiting for them. None escaped that way. The river rushed up in steam, and the fog fell on Dale. In the fog, the dragon came up and destroyed most of the warriors, the usual unhappy story. It was only too common in those days. Then he went back and crept in through the front gate and routed all the halls and lanes and tunnels and alleys, cellars, mansions, and passages. All that there was no dwarves left alive inside, and he took all their wealth for himself. Probably that is the dragon way. He piled it all up in a great heap far inside, and slept on it for a bed. Later he used to crawl out of the great gate and come by night to Dale, and carry away people, especially maidens, to eat, until Dale was ruined, and all the people dead or gone. What goes on there now I don't know for certain, but I suppose anyone lives there near to the mountain that is the far edge of Long Lake nowadays. The few of us were all well outside, sat and wept in hiding, and cursed Smog, and we unexpectedly joined by Father and my grandfather, with singed beards. They looked very grim, but they said very little. When I asked how they got away, they told me to hold my tongue, and said that one day, proper time, I should know. And after that we went away. We had heard them earn our lives, and as best we could up and down the mountain, often enough sinking as low as blacksmith work or even coal mining. But we had never forgotten our stolen treasure, and even now, when I allow we have a good bit laid by and have not so badly off. Here Thorn struck a gold chain around his neck. We still mean to get it back, and to bring our curses home to Smog, if we can. I have only wondered about my father and my grandfather's escape. I see that now that they must have had a private side door, which only they knew about. But apparently they made a map, and I should like to know how Gandalf got a hold of it, and why it did not come down to me, the rightful heir. I did not get a hold of it. I was given it, said the wizard. Your grandfather Thor was killed, you remember, in the mines of Moria by Azog the Goblin. Curse his name, yes. And Thrain your father went away for the 21st of April, 100 years ago last Thursday. It has never been seen by you since. True, true. Well, your father gave this to me to give to you, and if you have chosen my own time, and the way of handling it over, you can hardly blame me, considering the trouble I had to find you. Your father had not remembered his own name when he gave me the paper, and he never told me yours. So on the whole, I thought I ought to be praised and thanked. Here it is, he said, handing the map to Thorin. I don't understand, said Thorin, and Bilbo felt he would like to have said the same. The explanation did not seem to explain. Your grandfather, said the wizard slowly and grimly, gave the map to his son for safety before he went to the mines of Moria. Your father went away to try his luck with the map after your grandfather was killed, and lots of adventure and a most unpleasant sort he had. He never got anywhere near the mountain. How he got there I don't know, but I found him a prisoner in the dungeons of a necromancer. Whatever were you doing there? Asked Thorin with a shudder, and all the dwarfs shivered. Never you mind, I was finding things out, as usual, and the nasty, dangerous business it was. Even I, Gandalf, only just escaped. I tried to save your father, but it was too late. He was witless and wandering, and had forgotten almost everything except the map and the key. We have long ago paid the goblins of Moria, said Thorin. We must give a thought to the necromancer. Don't be absurd. He is an enemy far beyond the powers of all dwarves put together. If they could all be collected again from the far corners of the world, the one thing your father wished was for his son to read the map and use the key. The dragons of the mountain were more than big enough to ask for you. Hear, hear, said Bilbo, and accidentally said it out loud. Hear what? They all turned suddenly towards him. He was so flustered he answered, Hear what I have to say. What is that? They asked. Well, I should say that you ought to go east and have a look around. After all, there's a side door, and dragons must sleep sometimes, I suppose. If you sit on the doorstep long enough, I dare say you will think of something. And well, you don't you know? I think we'll have to talk long enough for one night. If you see what I mean, what about a bed, and an early start, and all that? I will give you a good breakfast before you go. Before we go, I suppose you mean, said Thorin. Aren't you the burglar, and isn't sitting on the doorstep your job, not speaking of getting it inside the door? But I agree about the bed and breakfast. I like 6 eggs with my ham, without starting on journey, fried, not poached, and mind you don't break 'em. After all, the others were ordered their breakfast without saying so much as please, which annoyed Bilbo very much. And then they all got up, and the Hobbit had found room for them. They filled the spare rooms and made beds and chairs and sofas. Without they got up, they stood and went there to his own very little bed, very tired, not altogether happy. One thing he made his mind up about was not to bother to get up very early and cook everybody else's rich breakfast. The tookishness was wearing off, and now he was not quite so sure that he was going on any journey in the morning. As he lay in his bed, he could hear Thorin still humming his voice in the bedroom next to him. Far over the misty mountain cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day, to find our long-forgotten gold. Bilbo went to sleep with that in his ears, and it gave him very uncomfortable dreams. It was long after the break of day when he woke up again.